Everyone, welcome to this roundtable on settler colonialism and deindustrialization. My name is Piyusha Chatterjee. I am a postdoctoral research associate within the DéPOT project and based at the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at the University of Glasgow. This is the first of 4 roundtables this year organized by the project's Race, Populism and the Left Working Group, which is the theme of our upcoming June 2025 conference in Paris as well. For most of you, the DéPOT project does not need an introduction. Those who may be new and have joined us on this platform for the first time, please do visit our website, deindustrialization.org, to know more about this transnational project that examines the political responses to deindustrialization, as well as its historical roots and lived experiences in different parts of the world. The call for papers for the 2025 Summer Institute and Annual Conference in France are out already. You will find them on our website, and perhaps Liam can share them on chat as well. As we enter the 4th year of the 7-year project, this roundtable takes up a challenging question, and it's a much needed one in the field. Dispossession of indigenous land is integral to histories of industrialization. Resource industries like forestry, mining, and oil are inextricably tied to the exploitation of indigenous peoples. Land acquisition for setting up factories and environmental contamination by industries are also important concerns in many communities around the world that experience displacement and face marginalization on lands where they have belonged for generations. Working on deindustrialization and understanding its effects on working class communities in different parts of the world, and particularly in settler colonial contexts, also brings up issues of systemic exclusion or marginalization of some population groups or communities within industrial economies. In very simple terms, the question that is sometimes posed to us is who and what are we mourning really as deindustrialization scholars? After all, the so-called good jobs lost during industrial closure were directly implicated in the ongoing dispossession of indigenous lands. The question then is this scholarship just mourning some kind of privileged working class past? Or does deindustrialization studies go beyond nostalgia to address questions of power and privilege and the entanglements of capitalism and colonialism that have anchored industrial societies in the West and also elsewhere? Issues of dispossession of land and natural resources are not unique to settler colonies, but this roundtable mostly focuses on the Canadian context today. Canada, as we are aware, has a long history as a settler colony where indigenous peoples and communities have been fighting against both state and capital to end unsustainable resource extraction and preserve their lands and natural environment for future generations. At this online roundtable, scholars of deindustrialization respond to these questions and propose some new directions of research in the field. And now, without further delay, we will move on to the session. A quick note on the format. We have 4 speakers today. Lachlan Mackinnon is unwell and he's unable to join. But we have 4 others, and each of them will have about 8 minutes. And at the 9th minute, I will give you a warning, and 10 minutes I will mute you, or Liam will mute you. We will also, Myriam Guillemette has to leave early, so we will have her first, and we will have some questions for her. And then we move on to Peter and Raechele and Petra. And then at the end, we will have the general discussion and Q&A session. So it's only for Myriam that we are going to stop a little and have some questions at the end of the first presentation. And to introduce Myriam, Dr. Myriam Guillemette is a postdoctoral fellow at the Université du Québec à Montréal and the University of Michigan. She studies the impacts of racial and ethnic discrimination within Canadian urban planning processes. She holds a doctoral degree in urban studies from the Université du Québec à Montréal and specializes in questions regarding cultural heritage. Her doctoral thesis pertains to Montreal's winter identity and the scientific relation between winter as a social construct and the unique characteristics that define the urban context. Her association with various pluridisciplinary research teams allows her to further her research on the various notions of heritage, more specifically, intangible and cultural heritage. And now over to you, Myriam.
Thank you, Piyusha. Let me just share my screen real quick. Can you guys see? Perfect. Well, I'll just be briefly speaking. It's a really rich topic, but I'll briefly be speaking on how settler colonialism fits within my research and the broader context of my research, which pertains to mining in northern Manitoba. So firstly, what we need to know when we speak about mining in Canada is that it is mostly located in what we can define as being these frontier areas. Globally, we see that mining is often located in traditional territory and ancestral lands of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. And one thing that is crucial when we speak about mining is that any area of Crown land which is not specifically protected from mining development, even those areas which are located in traditional lands, can technically be state. We see when we speak about mining in Canada that it's often located in those areas which are known as the provincial norths, the middle norths, or the mid-Canada corridor. In that area, we see that this broadly refers to Canada's subarctic belt. We see that it's an area where the majority of the industries are based on resource extraction. It's also an area which is defined by its lack of internal linkage, meaning that what is often produced locally is not consumed locally and vice versa. We see that this area is defined by a sort of lack of political representation, and we see that historically this area has failed to include the political participation of many Indigenous communities. So how does settler colonialism fits within that context? Well, we base our research on the definition of settler colonialism as a system of power which is perpetuated by settlers and which is aimed at erasing and replacing Indigenous culture. But we also base it on the fact that it is a system which continues to perpetuate the erasure of Indigenous population. Using this definition, we really base our research on the fact that this exploitation of the land has failed to include the Indigenous population when it comes to benefiting from the surplus that is produced by this exploitation. We also base our research on the fact that racial discrimination has heavily restricted Indigenous employment in the provincial north, specifically in those highly skilled, highly paid jobs. And that has sort of created a sort of relegation of the population, of the Indigenous population, as a sort of second-class citizens in their own traditional lands. When we speak about northern Manitoba more specifically, we see that the area of northern Manitoba has been Crown land and has failed to actually consult the population historically, and that continued until 1982. We see that the situation which is created in northern Manitoba really stems from when the area that is defined as northern Manitoba was added to the province in 1912. We see from then on that this area has sort of been depicted as a sort of blank canvas, which is really aimed to fulfill the economic needs of the South. We see that this situation has really created a situation which fostered the continual impoverishment of Indigenous communities in northern Manitoba. We also see in this area and in Canada as a whole that there's been a long history of Indigenous people seeking to join the labor market, but actually being pushed out by non-Indigenous settlers. This also fits within the Indian Act, which was aimed at assimilating Indigenous nations, but also kind of limited them to the working class, with offering actually few options for social mobility. we see that these government training programs were often more beneficial for the people giving the programs than for the people benefiting from these programs, which actually with restricting them to temporary low-paying jobs. This is a situation which is true to Canada and the mining industry, but it is even more present when we speak about northern Manitoba. To study this situation, we're focusing on one industrial town, which is the town of Thompson in Manitoba, located in northern Manitoba, which was created in 1956 by a mining company by the name of Inco. We see that Thompson is actually situated in traditional Nisishiwasek Cree Nation territory. When we speak about Thompson, one thing that is really fundamental is the comprehensive agreement which was signed by the government and the private company and defined the responsibilities for building and for dealing with the town and mine site. What is absent from...
Sorry, just to interrupt, the slides are not moving for you. Yeah.
Just give me a second then. Is it better?
Yeah.
Perfect. Going back to this agreement, we see that what was absent from this agreement was Manitoba's Indigenous population. It really defined the population and the territory, excuse me, as a sort of virgin land. It also failed to include the range of traditional subsistence activities which were taking place on that land. Also, furthermore, when the town was built and the mine was built, we see that there was a range of situations which really fostered a sort of employment and residential discrimination. We see that First Nations people and Métis were not officially allowed to work in the mine until 1962. There was also a lack of training programs for Indigenous workers. There was an employee referral program which was put in place by the company. And there was also the fact that preferential mortgages were offered to their employees. Overall, there was a sort of lack of an integration plan aimed at the Indigenous community, despite the mine and the town site being located near 12 reserves. Although the mine has been in continual decline since the 1970s, most recently we saw the closure of the mine smelter and refinery, which really affected the town's economy. There's been some attempts at diversifying the economy since 2011, but so far no clear direction has been taken. The lack of training and employment opportunities aimed at the Indigenous population is still being felt today. In the last years, there's been significant community-based economic development initiatives by the Cree Nation themselves, but there is still a strong inclination towards the hiring of temporary foreign workers to fill those current job vacancies, rather than the investment in training programs for Indigenous workers. We see when we look at Thompson that this really contributes to exacerbating the division and tensions within the community. This really perpetuates the loss of self-determination on both a political and social level, which originally originated from settler colonialism. So this is really how we're depicting our research, but we see how settler colonialism continues to affect the population today. And that is it.
Usually you're on mute.
Okay. Thank you, Myriam. Sorry about that. So questions for Myriam, because she has to leave early and she won't be available later. Please raise your hands if you can turn on your camera, or you can also use the chat function if you are unable to speak. And okay, Liam, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Myriam, for this. This is a really, really, really interesting sort of brief look into northern Manitoba. And I think it's a really good way to sort of look at how, the good jobs, were very much for settlers. I'm going to ask like a very, very silly question about sort of electoral politics, because like Churchill-Kawatnukaski, which is the riding that Thompson is in, is like one of the safest NDP seats in the country, held by like one of the most, if not the most, like left-wing NDP MP, Nikki Ashton, and her electoral coalition is those workers. and Indigenous peoples, right? And that is like a very interesting sort of dynamic that you get sometimes in the north of Canada, where you have that sort of like resource worker and Indigenous people electoral coalition. In some places you don't have it at all, right? So I'm wondering if you have like some reflections on like thinking about sort of like the whole like populism element and I guess the left element too of what we're talking about, how settler colonialism has sort of impacted potential coalition building between, say, like settlers and, Indigenous peoples in resource communities.
Well, I think in Thompson and other industrial communities in the north, there's a sort of economic downturn that's been happening. And instead of focusing on collective goals, we really see this like division in the community. So this economic downturn and the social situation which stems from this economic downturn is really blamed on the Indigenous community. So there's a sort of perception of the Indigenous community as an other. And we see that the status is even compared to those of immigrants. So they're sort of seen as not the rightful holder of the land, and they're kind of blamed for the situation. So I think there's a sort of difficulty in reconciliating those two communities, which really limits the possibilities of having this coalition. So it's really an us versus them mentality, although they are the settler community and they kind of took over the land. So there's a sort of a difficulty which is hard to address because there's no actual solution that's been proposed to foster a sort of ongoing reconciliation.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Myriam. That's really an interesting presentation. My own work, I've looked at Schefferville, which is an iron mining town in northern Quebec. And when you have, a mine closure in that case, but you can say industrial decline and population loss, I think you also see a shifting of balance of power, right? Because Indigenous people are those left behind, right? They're the ones that stay. This is their territory. And so in Schefferville, you see, a majority white town becoming a majority Indigenous town, and also like white Schefferville residents, starting to really shift towards other kinds of resources, so hunting and fishing, which then brings another kind of challenge, right, towards Indigenous communities. So I'm wondering how that's sort of working in this context.
Well, I think in Thompson, if I'm correct, the city is now 43% of the population has identified as being Indigenous. So we really see a sort of a 50-50 situation almost. And I'm not sure how that plays in, because these sort of hunting and fishing activities are still being done more in a sort of it's not a subsistence type of activity that's being done by settlers. So it's still seen as a sort of tourist destination in a way. So I think there hasn't been any sort of conflict in that sense, but the ongoing conflicts are still present, and the sort of land claims are still happening. But it's not. I don't think it's as present as in Schefferville.
Questions or comments for Myriam at this point? Aparna seems to have a comment. Aparna, do you want to unmute yourself to speak, or? Okay.
No, I'm coming. I'm just I'm sitting in my college. Can you see me? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I come from the urban planning background. So in our literature, we are always trying to conceptualize between this global south and global north. And it really sometimes, intrigued me when especially this last presentation made me think, it seems that, the dynamics all over the world is the same. It's always like the conflict between who came first. It's a power relation. So I was just wondering, with this entire thing of, this making a binary again of global south and global north seems to be not working, because there are pockets of global south and global north, and then the vice versa. So what is a distinct thing about it is still I'm not able to pinpoint, but this kind of representation, this presentation made me think, like how Canada is, because the way I perceive Canada as a homogeneous, so I think that's my lack of knowledge, or maybe that's the way it is for most people. So this global north, we just make it as one club. Yeah, I really like the presentation for this granular, kind of, study. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think you're right, because the dynamics of marginalization, I think, are more common than we think. And I think the terms global north and global south can be really limiting, because we see many similarities in many geographical areas.
Yeah.
Any other questions? David, do you have a question as well for Myriam? Otherwise,
No, it was just this comment that I made in the chat. Thank you very much. That it was very surprising to me how indigenous people are seen as non-local. No, for me it is like remarkable colonial. No, it's highly colonial, and I was surprised because of it. That's all. Thank you. I found the paper very interesting.
Thank you. I think that's the common thing about settler colonialism. It's really how they attempt to frame the local population as a sort of outsider, I think, to justify the colonialism that is taking place.
Maya.
So thank you very much for the presentation, Myriam. It is very interesting because I'm working in the global south. I'm working in Chile in an indigenous place, but we have a quite different experience because the Spanish colonization was with very deeply mixed. I mean, they get families here. So actually all the Chileans have like a half and a half of indigenous and maybe Spanish blood, So it's quite interesting in one way because we also have the recognition of the indigenous people, but at the other point, it is how you can really find the way to understand the discrimination. For example, what is the questions are many in terms of how you can identify. I mean, yeah, the identification of the different groups. So what we are dealing now, it's just to understand how that mix and that contact can make a difference, new ways to live, and how the industrializations makes a very deeply colonization of not just the land and the people, then also of our minds, like how the people start to thinking in this new modern era and how they change their life, their cosmology, I'll say that. So it is very interesting now, now after the closure, because all the project of heritage, the industrial heritage project, there you go. You can find how the people start to move themselves, makes their own activism, about their past, and they recognize the indigenous, they recognize the discrimination, they recognize everything, but not with a feeling of being really low, or maybe the low are the most people who is living there, and they make very beautiful things without money, without the government, so I'm quite interested in how the social movement in the northern Manitoba is making now. I mean, we have here a lot of social activism. So what happened with that there, where the situation maybe is a little different, but at the same time, the phenomenon of colonialism, it is there also, you know. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think I didn't have time to mention it because I only had 7 minutes, but there's been really strong activism, especially since the 1970s, and there's been many successes in Thompson. We see that the stop signs have been translated in Cree. We see at the entrance of the town that there's been formal recognition that this is in traditional land. There's also been a historical thing that happened a few years back where there was the creation of an urban reserve. We see that the city has transferred a quite large amount of land to the community themselves, and they've built social housing, they've built a hotel. So there's been really some great things that have been happening. And I think I didn't have time to mention it, but there's still a lack of recognition of this discriminatory past, which is the thing that's sort of missing from all these great wins. So I think there's some good, and there's still some things to work on.
Nice. Definitely, we need to keep in touch, eh?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So any other burning questions for Myriam at this point? If not, I encourage you to use the chat button to kind of leave comments, feedback for Myriam. I'm sure she'll be able to access them afterwards, even if she has to leave early. So for the sake of time, we will move on to the next presenter, who is Dr. Peter Thompson. He's the Dean of Arts on the Fredericton campus of the University of New Brunswick and a professor in the Department of English. He has published widely on representations of deindustrialization in literature and popular culture of Atlantic Canada and Appalachia. In 2019, he published a book, Nights Below 4th Street, Literature and Popular Culture in Post-Industrial Nova Scotia with McGill Queen's University Press. Over to you, Peter.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm just going to try to share my screen here. Right. So can you see that? Great. Okay, so I just really have the one image. So the project that I'm working on, which I've talked about a few times in these roundtables, is looking at the Northern Pulp paper mill site in Pictou, Nova Scotia. So we're moving from the west to the east here in Canada. And I want to think about this as a kind of a record of this clash that Myriam's talking about between settler society and the Mi'kmaq history of the site. So I'm not going to talk too much about the project itself, but I'll just give you a sense of kind of the case study that I'm working on, and then I'll get into the kind of conceptual issue that I want to talk about today. So the short version of the site that I'm talking about is that in the 1950s, the Nova Scotia government facilitated the development of a craft paper mill in Pictou, which for decades dumped waste into Ashek, or Boat Harbor, which is a wetland that's claimed by Pictou Landing First Nation. And it's the Mi'kmaq site just outside of where the mill was. So the mill struggled with profitability for most of its existence and survived largely on government bailouts. In 2014, the mill spilled 47 million liters of toxic untreated effluent into local wetlands, which triggered a blockade and protests. And then at that time, the Nova Scotia government gave the mill a period of time, so up until about 2020, to find a more environmentally acceptable way of operating. And when these efforts failed, the mill closed, which set off a different round of protests. And we saw a lot of scapegoating of the Mi'kmaq community, a lot of what, again, what Myriam was talking about. So the site sat idle since this time, and it's the subject of ongoing litigation. In May, there's a settlement reached that confirms that the site won't be reopened. So what I want to think about is the mill site in relation to a couple of different narratives around Pictou County. So Pictou County talks about itself as the cradle of industry in Canada, but we need to think about how this fits into a broader kind of question about settler Indigenous claims to the space of northern Nova Scotia. So in the brief time that I have here, I want to talk about some of the conceptual issues related to this question. So when we were working on the cultural representations section of the Routledge Handbook of Deindustrialization Studies, when I was working on my chapter, Sherry Lincoln, who was the editor of that section, we talked a lot about what cultural representations or cultural studies can add to the study of deindustrialization. And I'm an English scholar, so I think about this. I think about deindustrialization often from the standpoint of literary criticism or the ways that it's represented in literature and popular culture. So one of the things I think that literary studies can sort of help us with is getting back to some of these questions that we've been talking about already. So often when we think of deindustrialization through the lens of settler colonialism, we can easily frame this as an issue as a contest over resources. So for example, if we think about my case study, we might want to think about the question of who worked at a place like Northern Pulp, or the process that led to the land being appropriated, how unions represented Indigenous people or not, like these types of questions. But what literary studies might tell us is that this framing can deflect attention from more basic questions, like who actually owns the land? How is it possible as a kind of like a mindset to dump effluent into this place with impunity for 5 decades? And so cultural studies tells us that there might be something more fundamental going on here. And it tells us that the tension that we're talking about really is about competing claims to belonging in the space. So the construction of industrial infrastructure and the development of modernity in places like Pictou and our memorialization of these events in the post-industrial era establishes the story of the settler presence as permanent and unquestioned. And what I might argue is that the deindustrial or post-industrial moment sort of disrupts this idea of continuity. So I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for a second. So the post-industrial moment disrupts this idea of continuity. It introduces this kind of narrative disruption. So one thing that I can start with is we can talk about the kind of basic problem of settler colonialism as it relates to deindustrialization. So if we think of Fred Burrell's work on this, Burrell argues that settler colonialism is most succinctly defined by Métis scholar Chelsea Vowell as the deliberate physical occupation of land as a method of asserting ownership over land and resource, a mode of domination, in the words of Lorenzo Verancini, characterized by the fact that settlers rarely sail away from their initial act of colonization. So settler colonialism is thus more of a process than an event, a distinct form, as Penelope Edmonds writes, with specific material and political effects. So in Canadian literary criticism, the way that this emerges is around this idea of belonging or authenticity or autochthony. It's often called nativism, settler nativism. And so the basic argument that's put forward by Cynthia Sugars and others is that Canada's settler society suffers from a sense of what we might call unhomeliness or a crisis of belonging. Sugars calls this, quote, the compromised position of the settler invaders' articulation of belonging in Canada. Oh, sorry, I can't see the paper.
It's 8 minutes.
8 minutes. Oh my goodness. Okay.
Maybe you can wrap up.
Yeah, I'll wrap up. Sorry. So in other words, the idea that the settler society is haunted by the sense that it doesn't belong. And so if we follow this thread into Indigenous studies, we learn from people like Val, Tuck and Yang, Zoe Todd, that this paranoid feeling manifests itself in all kinds of ways. So the actual or narrative erasure of Indigenous people, the kind of violent assertion of dominance over the land that we see in moments like Kanesatake or in Nova Scotia, when the problems with the fishery in the South Shore happened. And we can talk about other things as well. So in other words, the relationship between settler society and Indigenous people in Canada proceeds not just as a contest over land and resources, but as a kind of existential struggle over who belongs in the land and who claims ownership. And so the argument that I'd like to think about is how the post-industrial moment, the closure of a place like Northern Pulp, introduces this narrative disruption that creates different types of futures that we might imagine. And this is what Stephen's work on Schefferville teaches us as well. Like it takes settler society away from the center and opens up these other ways of kind of thinking about what the site's going to be in the future. So I'll turn it over to questions or to the next person. I'm not sure how we're proceeding. I'm sorry for going over.
Sorry to have interrupted you, but I'm sure there will be time to come back to some of the things that you still have to say. We'll move on to the next person at the moment, and we'll take questions at the end of all three speakers now. So Raechele Lovell is a passionate activist. She's rooted on a block of the Haldimand Tract, colonially known as Kitchener in Ontario, Canada. Her journey in the arts began as a child on tour with the polyrhythmic dance and music of her Caribbean heritage, igniting a lifelong quest for creative expression. A biracial artist, Raechele draws on her Afro-Caribbean and German Mennonite heritage in her work. Raechele's work is deeply anchored in her decolonial praxis, a framework nurtured through the Anit-Africa method under the mentorship of D.B. Young Anit-Africa at the Ubuntu Decolonial Arts Center. As the founder and executive artist director of Diverse Works Dance Co., Raechele envisions a future where Afrocentric artistry thrives. Her latest project, Uncovering Roots, delves into the historical and contemporary narratives of deindustrialization, exploring personal and collective resilience through movement. Over to you, Raechele.
Hello, everyone, and please excuse my background because the lawnmower started right at the beginning of my presentation. So hopefully you can hear me. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Just give me 1 second. There it is. Oh, I need to just move this. Okay. Great. Do we see, oh, I think we see the wrong screen. Tell me if you see the slideshow.
We don't.
You don't. Try again. There we go. How about now?
Okay.
Great. Alrighty, so good morning, everyone. I'm Raechele Lovell. As mentioned, I'm the 2024-2025 Artist in Residence with DéPOT, and today I am here to explore or to present my project Uncovering Roots, which explores the intersections of settler colonialism, deindustrialization, and identity. This project was rooted in my personal history and asks a fundamental question: who am I and how did I get here? Ooh. So I was born in Kitchener, Ontario, a place that has rarely felt like home, shaped by the systemic racism that's embedded into its structures. My father's lineage reaches back to Barbados, where my childhood unfolded to the rhythms of steel drums, cultural echoes of a Caribbean past. At the same time, my upbringing was immersed in my mother's German heritage within Kitchener, a city that's built on colonial and industrial legacies. This complex intersection of identities has driven my lifelong quest for understanding and ultimately led me down the path of decolonization. During my grandmother's 100th birthday celebration in Barbados last year, I uncovered a critical piece of my family's story, our ties to the Raechele plantation, one of the oldest and most notorious sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Established in the 1650s, Raechele was built on the labor of enslaved Africans, and its legacy of exploitation continues today. It's still owned by the original family, a British member of Parliament, Richard Drax, inherited the plantation in 2017. The wealth generated by plantations like Raechele shaped the global economy while leaving lasting scars on the descendants of those who toiled there, my ancestors included. Worth noting that the conditions were so deplorable that the average life expectancy was 7 years. This revelation deepened my understanding of colonialism's impact on my family and the Caribbean, but it also sparked a reflection on how these same colonial structures exist in my life in Canada. Both places have been shaped by the violent appropriation of land and labor, and both are grappling with the enduring legacies of exploitation. Settler colonialism in Canada took a different but parallel form, displacing Indigenous peoples and exploiting their lands to build industries like mining, forestry, and agriculture. These industries were central to Canada's economy. They were built on the backs of Indigenous disposition. In my hometown of Kitchener, this legacy continues to unfold. Most recently, the region of Waterloo has been embroiled in a controversy surrounding the expropriation of 770 acres of prime farmland in Wilmot County for industrial development. Led by Karen Redman, this move echoes colonial land grabs of the past, prioritizing economic growth over the rights and livelihood of local farming communities. Most recently, the region chose to destroy 160 acres of corn just weeks out from harvest, costing taxpayers $160,000. Local activists and farmers have voiced their concerns. This is a photo of them destroying the corn. This happened in August, 5 weeks before it could be harvested. The local activists and farmers have raised their concerns about the loss of fertile land while the region pushes forward, emphasizing the need for industrial expansion at the expense of sustainability. This raises questions about food security, environmental degradation, and the ethical implications of land use. Moreover, the region's defunding of the arts while pursuing land acquisition reflects a broader disregard for cultural and environmental sustainability in favor of industrial interests. These actions mirror how settler colonialism has consistently prioritized economic interest over the rights of marginalized communities, much like the historical exploitation of Raechele. So resistance is my generational inheritance. My great uncle Israel Lovell played a leading role in the 1937 Labor Rebellion, a movement challenging colonial rule and exploitation. His legacy of resistance is something I carry into my work today, where I use art to confront ongoing injustices. In Kitchener, I've also faced systemic challenges, particularly during my time as the chair of the Region of Waterloo Arts Fund, where I spoke out about institutional racism and administrative violence. The region's ongoing prioritization of economic development over human rights and environmental justice continues to be a point of contention. Much like Israel's role in Barbados, the resistance in Wilmot Township against the expropriation of farmland is a modern day battle against colonial systems that continue to prioritize industry over land and community rights. As a biracial person of Caribbean and German descent, I find myself in the crosshairs of these overlapping histories. Uncovering roots is a way to explore these intersections, my way of unraveling these tangled legacies, asking the question, who am I and how did I get here? Through Uncovering Roots, I use dance, theater, visual projections to bring these personal histories to life. One specific example is my movement-based piece, which I'll be presenting at the DéPOT assembly in June. And it reenacts the physical and emotional impact of displacement using the rhythms of steel drums, a nod to my father's heritage, and underscores the tension between home and exile. In this project, I not only focus on personal healing, but on a collective reclamation. I draw parallels between the ongoing resistance to the expropriation of land in Ontario and the historical fight for freedom in Barbados. They are currently in active discussions about reparations that are ongoing, and showing how colonial structures continue to shape our present. Art becomes the platform to reclaim these stories and make space for marginalized voices like my ancestors to be heard. The connections between settler colonialism, deindustrialization, and my search for identity are deeply intertwined. Whether it's the legacy of the Raechele plantation or the modern-day expropriation of Wilmot Township, these stories reveal how colonial structures still hold power. To summarize, the legacy of colonialism is not just a chapter in history. This story is personal and ongoing, from Raechele's exploitation of enslaved Africans in Barbados to the region of Waterloo's plans. The structure of power remains the same. My project, Uncovering Roots, is an act of artistic defiance. It challenges the erasure of histories and the continued exploitation of land and communities through my art. I invite you, as I ask myself, who am I and how did I get here, to reflect on this question of your own identity and consider the systems of power that shape our world. This is my contact information if you are interested in more about my project. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to our discussion on how we can resist these structures of art, scholarship, and collective action. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we will move on to our last speaker of the session. Dr. Petra Dolata is Associate Professor of History at the University of Calgary, a former Canada researcher in the history of energy who held previous academic positions at the Freie Universität Berlin in Germany and at King's College London in the UK. Her research examines the 1970s energy crisis, the history of energy production in Canada's north, transatlantic energy relations, and the historical connections between deindustrialization and energy transitions. From 2019 to 2023, she was a scholar in residence at the Calgary Institute for the Humanities, where she co-convenes the Energy in Society Research Group. She is also the author of a German book, the title of which translates to The German Coal Crisis and its National and Transatlantic Dimensions. And Petra will give you the German title of the book.
Thank you, Piyusha, and good morning, everyone from Calgary or Mackinnon on Treaty 7. I will talk about a project that I'm involved in, and I will have my partners actually present that project, but I will preface it with 3 observations that maybe also gets our discussion started, but which is at the heart of this project. So this is about oil exploration in Norman Wells, which is in the Northwest Territories, which started in 1920 and is still ongoing. It is in the Sato region, so it affects the Sato Dene and Métis. And one of the things that I think is very important to realize is that not only is industry and industrialization a settler project, but even the language around industry, industrialization is. I think it's very important to realize that terms like frontier, industry, industrialization are already in themselves looking at the land in a very particular way. And my partners, when they want to talk about the history of Norman Wells, they are much more interested in the impact on the land, but also in the way that legal steps have created particular ownership, as we have heard already. So the reason why there is a Treaty 11 between the Crown or the Canadian government and the Métis, the Sato Dene, is exactly because oil was founded in 1920, and so an agreement was made in 1921. So I think it's important for us to realize how difficult and complex it might be to talk about deindustrialization when even the language around industrialization is something that is considered as part of the settler project. Secondly, in the archives, often the Indigenous workers are absent, but as we will see in a minute, they were actually there, but they were non-unionized, and they were doing the work that no one else wanted to do, such as cleaning barrels, oil barrels. But also even more invisible were a lot of the Indigenous women supporting the camps through food and their local knowledge. Thirdly, I think it's the most important sort of answer to some of the questions posed today from our project would probably be to talk about how we as researchers can support communities in their efforts to deal with the coming reclamation and remediation of industrial sites. And here in particular, this pertains to 7 artificial islands that were built in the Mackenzie River to get to the oil and gas. And this is kind of what I want to preface it. And I actually leave it to my partners in the communities to talk about this project and ask Liam to start a video, the link to which I have also just posted in the chat, and we will stop at 6 minutes and 10. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Leon Andrew. I live in Norman Wells, but I was born and raised in Toledo, in particularly the west side of Toledo, Mackenzie River, in among the mountains. And many trails I have traveled in those areas. Sucker Creek has been the major focus for the Mountain Dene people beginning at time. The Sucker Creek area is rich in fish, grayling, sucker, I guess that's why it's called Sucker Creek, and there's a lot of bird fowl there too. And occasionally you go into the lake, there's a lot of moose, etc., etc. So people can survive if you're a hunter. According to what we talk about, UNEP and ourselves in the mountain, those are places where meant to be for wildlife, the habitat. So Norman Wells is something like that, like the grayling, that's their place to go. Their birthing place, let's put it that way. And so some of the geese too, they come by, stop there, because there's food for them.
On August 23, 1920, an Imperial Oil crew struck oil at Discovery Well No. 1. The well was located across the river and just downstream of Sucker Creek. The following year, Imperial built a small oil refinery there. More than 100 years later, Imperial Oil continues to extract oil and natural gas from the ground beneath Norman Wells.
People, I like the way they say, land of the caribou, land of the moose, or wetland for the birds, and fish migration route. I like the way they describe it. They don't say belong to me, they say it belong to the wildlife, the land. So there's a lot of concern out there. So when we talk about how development occur and so on, I think people should take into account what happened to the wildlife. What about them? Because that's what our people will eventually survive on, you know. So that's where our people's mind is, I believe. So that's what we're about, the Petroleum History Project.
The Petroleum Histories Project was initiated by Edzo Gotine Gotse Nakedi, the Sahtu Renewable Resources Board, and the Norman Wells, Tulita, and Fort Good Hope Edzogotine, the Renewable Resources Councils, in 2021. Together, community members and collaborators are working to document the historical and ongoing impacts of Imperial Oil's operations at Norman Wells on the land, water, fish, animals, people, and Dene and Métis Tsili, our ways of life.
If you backtrack, you can just imagine things that have been 100 years, there's a lot of machinery move over the land since that time. The different species into the world, different plants coming into the land through vehicle tracks, and different chemicals being brought into the land that have been used for productions. Those are all concerned.
The Petroleum Histories Project is preserving Dene and Métis stories and knowledge so future generations know how petroleum extraction at Norman Wells has affected the land and people of the Sahtu. The idea for this project came through a series of virtual study circles about Sahtu history. Study circles continue to bring together community members and collaborators on Zoom to generate and share knowledge. Over the last 3 years, the Petroleum Histories Project has hosted 18 study circles on topics like Treaty 11, the Canal Project, the Artificial Islands, and closure and reclamation of the Norman Wells operations.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Yakalaya. I'm from Tulita. My homeland is Willow Lake. On the map, it's called Brackett Lake. I've been working for the SRB since 2022. I started off as a research intern, and now I got promoted to research coordinator. Working on this petroleum history project, I'm able to listen to all these extraordinary stories that had happened in the past due to oil industry, mining industry, or just any other industries that grew up on the land. Listening to the oil industry stories, listening to the construction stories that have happened in our area is really, it's really sad, listening to people that had to be moved away because there was some either oil, mineral, or something unique in that area of their campsite. They had to be moved away. I would hate for an industry to come and tell me I have to move because they want something in that area.
In addition to providing a space for sharing stories and knowledge.
Thanks, Liam. Thank you all.
So I'm assuming, Petra, you don't have any concluding words at the moment. Okay. So we can